Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Plenary Session 4, Governance of a More Splintered Digital World. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm an Associate Fellow with the International Security Programme at Chatham House and editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy. If we have a great panel, most of whom are joining us remotely, so we will have a true hybrid session. We've only got an hour, so we've got a huge amount to pack into the programme. I think if we were holding this session 10 years ago, the topic would have been about a lot more optimistic, about the power of technology to break down barriers, to enhance freedoms and democracy. But against a backdrop of growing international contestation, it seems that the forces for fragmentation are just growing stronger and stronger. So we have got a great panel here to discuss this question. We have Dame Wendy Hall, who's joining us from Southampton. She's the Professor of Computer Science. We have Dr. Samir Saran, who is the president of the Observer Research Foundation in India, joining us in person. We have Ava Maydell, MEP, who's joining us remotely as well. And last but not least, Julie Owono, who is the executive director of the Internet Sans Frontières and also a member of the Meta Facebook Oversight Board. So, Wendy, if I could start with you, I was saying to you in the green room that I always teach your 4 internets model, which, if you haven't come across it, is oh, that's a coincidence. Congratulations on the new book. But I've heard...
It's not that new anymore.
Well, newish book. But when a lot of our mutual colleagues, when we're talking about a splintering or fragmentation of the internet, a lot of people who I really love and respect are like, why don't we just get on with it, the sooner the better, and then just have our own Western internet and let China do its own thing. Do you think that's where we should be heading? Is that inevitable?
Absolutely not. It's not inevitable, and I think it would be very dangerous. If you asked me that question, I've been thinking about it. Actually, the best way to explain why that's dangerous is because if you just let that happen, the internet would become much more like the mobile telephone network. You'd have to know people's numbers on the internet, and you'd have to have the right. You'd have to pay your, whatever bill you had to pay to access the other people on the internet outside your network. Right, that I don't think the internet will go that way, and just think about what happened at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020. We all piled onto the internet. It was the only way to communicate with friends, family, work colleagues, family around the world. I mean, it's not, just because you're a civilian in Western democracy doesn't mean all your family lives there, right? It doesn't mean all your business colleagues are there, So what happened at the beginning of the pandemic was that the internet stayed up and running, right? It didn't crash, and basically that's a huge testament to the pioneers of the internet in the 60s and 70s, and then what Tim Berners-Lee did in the 90s, that it stayed up and running, and we should treasure that. But we have to think of it. And so I'm just going to, because I haven't got long, talk about the main thesis of Kieran O'Hara, my thesis about how we say there are 4 internets. There might be more you could discuss, but basically what's still in existence is the open, ubiquitous, universal internet that was run through the TCP/IP protocols that was set up by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn. That's what kept us all going at the beginning of the pandemic. And the fact that the openness of that, and we go into this in the book, is both its strength and its weakness, okay? And yes, you're right. When Tim came up with the protocols for the web on top of the internet, we thought, well, we'll spread democracy everywhere. And that hasn't turned out how we thought it might. And partly it's to do with we live in nation states that have very different cultural values, and you have to understand you can't just change those cultural values by inventing a new piece of technology. In fact, what it's done in a way is enhance. And the other three internets we talk about is the commercial internet. In America, it's market force led. For the Western democracies, that's where all the big hyperscalers are. There are none in Europe, anywhere else. They're all on the west coast of America. They lobby Washington for the regulations and the laws that they need to help them grow as companies. There's nothing wrong with making money on the internet, but that's because of the network effect. That's where our data's ended up, and I could go on more about that. So that's our second internet. Our third internet is Europe, which is where we've got an MEP and us me from the UK here, where Europe has led very much on data protection. GDPR, it's a global standard. It's not necessarily one everyone buys into, but it's fully data protection. It's data protection led. That's what Europe has done, for good or bad. And again, that has strengths and it has weaknesses. But it's our cultural value in Europe. Very much we believe in that protection. And then you go further east and you come to China. Huge, dwarfs us in terms of scale of the number of people that live in the Chinese internet governance, which is authoritarian. You could call it surveillance, but in the book we call it paternalistic, because from the very get-go, the Chinese government understood quicker than anyone else, really, that the internet would be a way to disseminate information, but also to control potentially and control content, which is what we don't do in the West. But these are cultural, and this will play out in AI as well as the internet. We have to understand that we're not going to shift the cultural values of 1.4 billion people overnight, and we have to work with, if we want to protect the ubiquity. I'm going to say two other things. There's another model we talk about in the book, which is we call it the spoiler model, which we argue, we give it credit that to Moscow, where we think about people who we don't credit them with an internet, but they hack in other people's internets. They try to bring things down and to create fake news and try and attack us in a different way. And then we also give a whole chapter in the book to India, because India is another 1.4 billion people. It has rolled out the internet. It has the ability through the Aadhaar ID to roll out the internet to the whole country. Amazing opportunities there for India, but it really depends how India decides how to govern the internet and how to use it, as to whether they go more towards a Chinese type of model or a Western democracy type of model. And that the numbers there could sway the future of the internet. Because the other thing to say is that China, of course, if you look at Africa, China's very much influencing the way the internet's rolling out in Africa, and the islands of the South Pacific, some of South America too, even bits of Europe. So I think we have to recognize this and work with it, because if we go for the splinternet model, we just lose everything, the connectivity that the internet gives us. We lose all the opportunities and are left with the threats.
Thank you very much.
I'll stop there for now.
Well, we could go on, and I'm sure that there'll be more questions, Wendy, on those four internet models. And you've teed up our next speaker, Samir, very nicely when you talked about the role of India in the future as one of the countries that could determine the direction of a splintered or non-splintered digital governance. Samir, could I just ask you for your perspective on that, and what the consequences of a splintering would be for India, but also some of the global south more generally, as Wendy was mentioning, sub-Saharan Africa, the islands, and the role of China. Can I just say, before you go to Samir, I really wish people wouldn't talk about the splinternet. It just is so misleading, because I don't think it will happen. But we have differences of views about how we govern the internet, so which will create virtual fragmentation geopolitically. But I'll sorry, Samir, I just hate the term splinternet, so I had to say that. Got it. fragmentation.
So, I'm going to actually, I'm on Wendy's side on this. I think we are not necessarily moving towards a splinter net. What is really changing now is trust in technology. And for our own different reasons, people are more anxious about the technology offerings that are available, the technology offerings they embrace, they use for their existence, communication, livelihood, healthcare, and every purpose, right? And I think there are 4 important factors that are contributing to this higher level of anxiety around technology. We are more anxious about our digital future or about our digital world. I think the first for me would be the politics of technology. And of course, we heard the description of China tech and Chinese governance models, which are authoritarian, paternalistic, in service of the Communist Party of China. We have different shades in the middle, and as we reach the west coast of America, they suddenly, from communist tech, they become mercantilist tech, right? And it's all about extractive nature of technology. All of us are data for them, and we are meant to be used, abused, consumed. So we have this whole spectrum of anxiety. Depending on which part of the world you reside in, you will have a different assessment of each of those 4 models or many more that Wendy described. So Wendy had a certain question on the China model. I'm quite certain the Chinese would question the American model as well. So, depending on, where you sit is where you stand in some sense. And I think we must recognize this. The politics of the world is not going to be reconciled on the net. We must stop trying to do that. We must recognize that we all operate under different constitutions. That's why we have our own countries and sovereignty. And we are not going to have erosion of cultural boundaries that do exist. And if the internet is seen to be a medium to remove the differences, we are going to begin to question the efficiency of the internet. But if we see internet as a way of getting communication stronger, to bridge the differences, to understand perspectives, and in some sense to celebrate diversity of how we assess the world, then the internet is certainly not going to be splinter net. It is going to be a medium that works and that helps us celebrate the diversity. But if we are evangelical, that there is only one value system and that's British, or one value system and that's Indian, or one value system and it's American, then we are going to obviously hit a wall there. And not just the Great Firewall of China, but every country is going to erect a wall to prevent their cultural erosion from happening. So that's the second point. The third point, of course, is that many in the emerging world, and I don't speak for the global south, I'm one voice in 1.4 billion people in India, and I will change my mind in the evening. So I'm just giving you a perspective from right now. And that perspective from right now is that many of us see in technology potential for changing our lives. Our growth is not going to happen through manufacturing. Our growth is not going to happen through slave trade. Our growth is going to happen through the 4th industrial revolution. And for us, technology becomes crucial, and a connected world becomes pretty much the basis of our aspirations and our transformations. And for us, what is happening is disturbing, and the recent couple of incidents are of great concern. The first, of course, is the increasing use of deep penetration software and devices and tools and all sorts of bots and vulnerabilities for controlling our personal spaces, for invading our privacy, for making us a product rather than a person. And I think that is concerning, whether it is companies who do it, whether it is countries who do it, whether it is a communist regime or a democratic regime. As long as we are being constantly under someone else's gaze for a different purpose, it concerns us. That is one worry. The second is that Wendy mentioned the telecom system, mobile phones or telephone systems, which is an interesting point to bring and to discuss today. The Ukraine-Russia conflict, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Whichever side you sit in. The fact is, the behavior of global tech giants is a cause of concern to many of us in the global south, in the emerging parts of the world. Now, if the technology companies start taking political sides And I'm not talking about the righteousness of their cause or the morality or the ethics. The fact is that we have fought wars in the past, the telephone lines still worked. We did not cancel a country from the telephone map of the world. You have cancelled Russia in this conflict. And I think that is something that is going to raise eyebrows in parts of the world who depend on the availability of these platforms for existence. You cannot cancel Twitter in certain parts of the world because Twitter is dispensing a governance function of health, of education, of financial literacy, of communities. Once you start having the power to make technology platforms partisan, and make them take political sides, no matter what the provocation might be. I think we have to rethink the role of many of these platforms. Else, please understand, in many parts of the world, American corporations are already looked with suspicion. And when they see that these big four tech companies have aligned with the American side of the conflict, it is going to embolden many in many parts of the world to actually reject them from having any significant presence in their own economies and nation and society. So I think the weaponization of technology, and of course, Russia has weaponized it in different ways, influence operations, fake news, electing the president of the United States. Russia has played its own, has used it and abused it as well, and we are doing the same when we respond to it in a similar way. And I think that's the third point. And the final point, of course, is that we also have to understand that there is an economic element and an affordability and access element. Here we are having a very elite debate on the contours of governing the tech. For many people, it is access to technology and access to device and access to the internet is itself an aspiration. So when a Chinese comes to South Africa and says, here, take a mobile phone and a mobile system and broadband and internet connection, don't begrudge them. Don't give them a lecture on the value systems. Either go and put your own systems there and invest in building those continents, or stay out of the way. So I think access and affordability are still the criteria for 6 billion who are not going to be listening to this debate that we are having today. And for those 6 billion, an affordable internet still is the main reason. And by the way, I like the EU GDPR policy. I think the EU GDPR policy was not inclusive and plural, but it is certainly quite prolific in the sense that many countries are going to be adopting it in different variants. And in that sense, although Europe may not have the bad boys from the West Coast or the boys from Beijing, but Europe is a very significant actor, and I think EU and Europe can, in some sense, offer us a path in between these two extremes, mercantilist and communist technology options that we have on the table.
Thank you very much, Samir. And Eva, that was a nice segue into the EU environment and EU's role in this increasingly multipolar digital world. And Samir summed it up nicely. You know, the EU may not have the tech giants. It may not be that sort of authoritarian force that's also very generous and long-term thinking in terms of its donation to developing countries. But the EU has become the world's regulator, if you like, through extraterritorial effect in GDPR and a whole raft of legislation that's come our way. On another view of it, I guess that legislation itself can be a force for fragmentation. How is it seen from your perspective and the role of the EU in either holding the internet together or as part of, you know, a rise of digital sovereignty? If everybody's digitally sovereign, then do we still have a single network?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, it's an honor to be sharing this panel with real experts and academics that have worked on the topic much longer than I have probably done so here in the European Parliament. But of course, as policymakers, we also need a new generation of members of Parliament across Europe and the world that more and more understand the role of technology and how we could propose some sort of legal frameworks that make sense. Maybe I would just first address a little bit, how I see things in this more global digital world. As it has been said, maybe in other words, I think whether we like it or not, we live in a world that's defined by power competition, and that power competition currently is between those democratic countries and those autocratic countries. And the world autocracies have created, I believe, this scenario. And until recent years, the democratic world, I think, has sought to build different type of bridges to this non-democratic world. But in the same time, today we see increasingly how some of those autocracies are turning our open societies and so to say the constructive cooperation that we want to bring forward against us. And I think we see that in a couple of areas when it comes to free speech, which is being weaponized to spread disinformation, for example. We see it in the free markets that are abused to economically coerce countries and companies. And of course, when it comes to our free and open internet, that I'm worried is at risk of being weaponized to create this dystopian surveillance state that many tech pessimists had feared. So if we see this as some sort of a backdrop, Europe's project to gain digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy is one of the strengths of the European pillar of the democratic world. But I don't want Europe to be this, to use this sort of terms and to get to these aims by somehow seeing itself as an isolated island in the world, by trying to be protectionist. I think we must build on the foundations that we have of increased and deepened cooperation with like-minded international allies. We are currently in a space race to develop artificial intelligence. And I think here it's not just a question of technological advancement and advantage. It's a question about the very nature, I think, of global governance, of security, of commercial activity, of economy, and whether that will follow rules-based democratic order or a global order that's dictated by some sort of, for example, communist dictatorship. And, I think some years ago, actually Putin himself said that whoever wins the AI race will rule the world. And I very much hope that this race will be won by the democratic society. And this is why I think, we must have two, overriding priorities. On one hand, to make sure that democratic world, not alone and not some sort in a fragmented way, brings forward this sort of frames of rules on topics such as AI. And we work together to set those global norms and standards in our own way and image, that they're human-centric, that they're built on values like privacy, civil rights, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to learn our experiences from the GDPR. It is one of the few forums that I've been that someone has addressed the GDPR as a global standard. More often when you're in Europe, you hear references to the GDPR that it's a golden standard. And for me, it's more important for it to be a global standard. And this is why, as Samir was saying, I think it's very important that going forward and working on legislation and some sort of legislative frameworks, we do not just consult ourselves, But we try to bring our democratic allies together and to see which areas we could find agreement. And I think we could do that through the newly established Trade and Technology Council, within NATO, the G7, the Council of Europe. I think we need to use the opportunity of the current difficult political and geopolitical situation to bind us.
Thank you.
And finally, I think, there are areas where we can create technological alliances of democracies that unites tech superpowers, not just in Europe, in the US, but with countries like South Korea, like Taiwan, like Japan. I think I see the future of global online governance more in this way. It would be, the way to have an open and neutral venue for innovation, for learning, for collaboration. But I'm worried that autocracies have unfortunately other plans. So I think it's important to now take some crucial and important steps to protect our own values online.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eva Maydell, MEP. Julie Owono, can I turn to you? You're a leader in a civil society organization. You're also a member of the Meta Facebook Oversight Board. We've all of the panelists have talked about the power of these enormous social media and other tech platforms, primarily West Coast US. If we're thinking about the future of digital governance, we have to also take account of how those processes are evolving. From your standpoint as a member of the Oversight Board, can you just give us some insight on how that's working and maybe how it could change for the better, as well as the role of civil society more generally? And then hopefully we can come back to some of the points raised by the panel. I'm going to also come out to the audience for your questions, so get thinking because it's your time next. Julie, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emily. First of all, I would like, of course, to thank Chatham House for the invitation. And I think this discussion is extremely timely, much necessary. And I would like to, before responding specifically to your question, Emily, I would like to also share a few remarks on, what has been said previously about the splintered or allegedly splintered world in which we are living now. I have to start by saying I completely agree. Openness, freedoms, democratic values, from my perspective, are at risk online, and there are various reasons for this situation. But obviously, the issue of harmful content, the impact of what our ability to share online, the impact of that, and the content that we're creating, the billion of content that citizens, governments, representatives around the world are creating daily, is challenging, to say the least. And in some situations, in some contexts, is forcing governments to make the most radical decisions and to close themselves out from this international bandwidth. The proof of that is the exponential increase of the number of internet shutdowns, for instance, or social media blockings around the world. Only last year, or even this year, countries like Sri Lanka, or even before, countries around the world have decided to cut off themselves either from the bandwidth or cut off themselves from platforms that allow people to share content. And one of the most famous last examples is, of course, Russia deciding to block access to certain social media platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, that are extensively used by citizens in that country, not only to exchange, but also to create value, economic value for themselves. That's the assessment. Now, while I agree that the internet should not be a force that threatens the locality, the local realities, the necessary contextual information that help us make sense of our societies and of our world. But I completely agree with that. I also want us all to remember that in one point in history, virtually all humanity, with experts from around the world, sat down together and drafted a series of texts that have put in writing what it means to be a human on this earth and have dignity by design. Excuse my expression, we're talking about technology, so I'm borrowing some expression from that field. Dignity by design, which means we have the right to speak, we have the right to think, we have the right to be religiously free, and many other rights that are so important, not only to the EU, not only to the United States, not only to Cameroon, my country, but to every country around the world who have all signed and committed to enforce and respect those fundamental human rights that make us the human, the dignified humans that we are. So that being said, I would say, despite there is a commonality. There has been a commonality around the world, despite the separations that we are seeing in this splintered, or at least these different fractions of the internet that are developing. I would say there is a commonality, and that commonality is we have been sacrificing those fundamental rights in the name of fighting the bad on the internet, and that applies also to democracies around the world, which until very recently, faced with the emergency of dealing with disinformation and, for instance, Russian manipulative disinformation online, or faced with the emergency of fighting hate speech, or faced with the emergency of fighting COVID misinformation, well, we have sacrificed freedom of expression. We have asked private actors, and I'm thinking here about big technology company content platforms, we have asked them to make decisions in a short amount of time, to make sometimes arbitrary decisions on content that should be allowed online or should not be allowed online. This is extremely dangerous, and that's why I'm particularly proud, I have to say, to be part of this new initiative that the Oversight Board is. We were created 2 years ago with the aim of making the protection of freedom of expression, freedoms and human rights in general, but freedom of expression specifically, on top of the agenda, and rather as a principle on the internet, or at least on content platforms that are Facebook and Instagram. And what does that mean? That means we make decisions on content moderation, decisions made by Facebook and Instagram, for instance, when a huge platform like Facebook decides to suppress access to his account to a former president of the United States. What does that mean from a democratic perspective? What does that mean from a freedom of expression perspective? Well, before 2020, that decision would have been made by a tech CEO who would have, behind closed doors, decided to prevent a president from expressing himself online. Well, after 2020, we now have a body of international experts who are located all around the world, who deeply care and deeply practice multi-stakeholder approach and governance to content governance issues, and who sit together to make decisions that are binding for Facebook and Instagram. And those decisions, we do not make them alone. We deeply work, consult, engage constantly with civil society organizations around the world. Just recently, I was part of a roundtable organized by the Facebook Oversight Board on how to document human rights violations on social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram specifically. Can we show images, harsh images of human rights violation that could make government be condemned on the international scene for its violation? So these are very hard questions to be asked to our societies in general. And I would like again to reiterate that we have an international framework that can guide us, that does take into account the local realities. And I personally advocate every day, especially here in the Silicon Valley, advocating for more building bridges between local expertise, those people who in their villages can tell us about what Boko Haram disinformation looks like, for instance. You cannot decide that from your office here in I don't know, Menlo Park or Palo Alto, or wherever you are. You cannot decide that from your office in Paris, only if you work in an organization, just like I did as the executive director of Untitled Chapter. I need to work with my colleagues who work in the different countries around the world where there are threats and where we should be looking at, because those threats are exactly the same ones that are going to backlash a few years, a few months from now in our, more democratic societies in the West. Yeah. So I'm here to say, yes to more inclusiveness of civil society organizations, yes to more local expertise, but let's not forget also that we have this incredible framework that's called the International Human Rights Law and Standards Framework that we as a community developed a few years ago, and that the Oversight Board, through its decisions, its binding decisions, but also its recommendations that have an impact on the company, that changes the company's rules and policies, well, we make those decisions to protect our human rights while addressing the harmful content.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers for framing the issue from your various perspectives. I have a question now for those in the room. Raise your hand if you think that some kind of fragmentation of digital technologies is inevitable. Okay, put your hands down. What about, raise your hand if you don't think it's inevitable. Okay, so raise your hand if you haven't raised your hand. Has everybody committed themselves? Well, so if you participated in that, and even if you didn't, could you just let me know if you would like to ask a question of the panel or make a comment? Okay, great.
Can you tell us, Emily?
Most people thought some sort of fragmentation was inevitable, Wendy, and only very few didn't. And most people seem to have committed themselves one way or the other. So, and it would be interesting to get your reflections, but I'm going to take a batch of questions. So I'm going to start with you, Heli, and then I've got a gentleman at the back and Lucian. So we'll go for you three, and then I'll take the next batch of questions. Thank you very much, Heli. And hello.
I'm Heli Dirma-Klaar. I'm the director of the Digital Society Institute at the ESMT Berlin right
Could you just speak up a little bit?
Yeah, okay. I have a question to Eva Maydell. European Union is coming up now with two groundbreaking new regulations, which is the Digital Single, Digital Market Act and Digital Services Act. And I think we have political agreement on both pieces of legislation. And I was just wondering, how would you see the implementation of those two quite important regulations happening and organized in Europe? And where do you see the European Union member states need to maybe increase their understanding of those issues and capabilities locally in order to properly implement those? Because member states have quite an important role in implementing those two pieces of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the back there, thank you. If you just speak normally, I think you're the microphone.
Can you hear me clear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is John. I'm a chief evening scholar from Malawi. My question goes to Samir. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very interesting, considering the country that I come from. We also, as Malawi, we do not have a strategy on AI or innovation. And India, as you put it across, banked on the internet and technology as its core. Now, as a country like ours, based on your experiences, what are the perils and opportunities that come with innovating in a space where there is no legislation? And is the innovation that is being done by your organization and your context in India driven by the government or driven by the private sector? And how does this fall within the context of legislation?
Thank you very much. Lucian?
Oh.
You nearly got him. Lucian Taylor, Oxford Information Labs. Hello, and thank you to speakers for a fantastic talk. Yeah, I know that the word splintered and splintered net is very triggering, but I happen to, and the question was, do we think it's going to become fractured in the future? I think it already was fractured at the outset. I love TCP/IP. I'm a great fan as an engineer of those protocols, but they were an academic exercise to model the possibility that a hostile nation such as Russia might do something aggressive. That's impossible, isn't it? So here we are, and we had a system that wasn't designed to be so successful. Wasn't secure enough, and the main thing is it wasn't multilingual. So most of the world still cannot communicate on the internet using their own script from their own language. And so we had kind of governance without standards. And we're trying to fix that with things like the International Domain Name Project. And that's an enormous exercise, and it's not really working. I think the GDPR is governance without standards. So we're all clicking on cookie notices. There's no standard sort of cookie setting on your browser. And we're having a kind of insufferable internet. And the platforms are solving inherent problems with the internet that were there from the beginning. And I fear, would you not, I ask the panel, do you not think that fracture is becoming more compacted? The techies are not working with the policymakers, and the policymakers are doing knee-jerk reactions to solve these long-term problems.
Thank you very much. So can I ask our panel for brief reactions there? Eva, you were asked about the implementation of the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and particularly the role of member states in that. And Samir, you had a question from John from Malawi about AI and innovation without legislation, and is it driven by government, is it driven elsewhere? And Lucian, I think your question probably we could put to Wendy and all the panelists about is the interplay between standards, legislation, and this network built on protocols that wasn't really intended or foreseen to be so successful internationally. And we can hear also from Julie on any of those questions. Eva, can I start with you? And hopefully we can do sort of brief answers, and I can go out because I know there are questions still waiting on the floor. I can see one already. So brief answers from everyone would be appreciated. Eva, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Maybe just one general remark when it comes to legislation, because the lady, I'm sorry, I couldn't catch your name because the sound was not good in the beginning of your intervention, said, we are laying the ground for some ground-breaking legislation with the DSA and the DMA. What is important for me as policymaker that I did not mention in the beginning of my introductory remarks is that we just, apart from whether it's golden or it's global, I think this sort of tech regulation and legislation that we put on the table, it should not be just, created in silos or it's its own kind of product. We have one and two and they address this or that different issue. All this digital legislation has to fit together like a jigsaw. Ideally, it's done in some sort of collaboration, as I said, with our international partners. So when it comes particularly to the DSA and the DMA, I need to say that enforcement will be the key, whether those legislation will be successful. But to do so, first of all, the Commission will need to have the right resources, the right expertise. We know that they're working on gaining that. And I think it's important when we speak about this sort of legislation to not just implement the letter of the regulation, but also the spirit of the regulation. And what I mean is that I think with the DMA and the DSA, there will be some sort of cultural changes as much as legislative ones. And so this is why I think we'll need to absolutely understand also the country specificalities and differences. When it comes to disinformation and the DSA, for example, I think it's great that we're going to have some sort of European standards. But if I understood also what Julie was saying and what I've witnessed with my conversations with civil society members in member states, there are different specificalities from one member state to another member state. So there could be the same problem when it comes to this information disorder that we are witnessing. But the way that some of the platforms are tackling this sort of disinformation does not always necessarily create the results that I think the platforms are aiming that they should create. And then you get a lot of displeased citizens by the decisions that platforms take, whether that's with a human oversight or AI oversight. I have come across so many numerous cases where, there's a lot to be done, and it's based to a country-specific case or a specific group case. And so I also think that we need to have a broader level and a need for resources for very large online platforms and also a more unified European approach. And I'm not necessarily sure that the DSA in general would deliver the high expectations that it currently has, but this is, for us to see, and enforcement again will be absolutely key.
Thank you. I'm going to cut you off there because I want to go to the other panelists. Apologies for that. Samir, can I just have your views on
my friend John from Malawi? So I think for you it's a great opportunity. It was famously said, India grows at night because bureaucrats were sleeping then. So if you don't have legislation and notification, this is the time to build your businesses. Go for it. Don't wait for someone to throw the rule book at you. Build your business models and make sure that the rule book supports it. And I think don't wait for anyone to come and show you the pathway. This is the time to be really adventurous. Like I said, you and I both have to build our countries and societies in the fourth industrial revolution. There is no roadmap. No one has taken low income to middle income in the fourth industrial revolution. We have to chart our own pathways. There is no ready to use guidebook available. So go for it. And of course, let me tell you, don't believe anyone who tells you that America has great tech legislation. It doesn't. It is the most ungoverned tech space in the world. All the tech bads come because there the governments don't know how to govern anymore. They only know how to give carrots. They don't know how to wield the stick. All the fallouts of technology that we are facing today is because of ungoverned spaces. So don't let anyone tell you that anyone else has done anything wonderful in the legislative space. So Malawi, build your Malawi internet and export it to India. On your question, sir, I think it's interesting, and this kind of leads in from my response to John. I think the biggest innovation center in the world does not have legislative coherence and a partnership with the technology companies. It is dysfunctional when you have the EU trying to do the job that US should have been doing in the first instance. So I think that distancing of regulatory proximity is a big inefficiency in the system today. So the coders in Silicon Valley don't understand the regulators of Europe, and yet these are the only two actors who are working in this space. And I think this regulatory gap needs to be filled. The Americans have done woefully bad in terms of being able to have a sensible regulatory conversation. Cowboy capitalism through technology is going to harm the world. And I think I love the Oversight Board, Julie, but I don't think the Oversight Board is the end goal. We need to do much more. I think it is time to bring more such conversations onto the table and make the boardrooms accountable. I don't want a world. I did not vote for India to be designed by Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not going to allow it. I don't care how many committees you create. He has no right to decide what is cancelled, what is censored, what is permitted, what is promoted, where he allows advertising, where he does not allow advertising. No one gave him the right. By the way, I work with Facebook, I work with Google. They are part of the solution. So they are not on the other side. They are on the same side. And we are having this conversation that yes, he should design his company, not my country. That was not his mandate. And I think that needs to be enforced.
Thank you very much, Samir. Julie and Wendy, I'm going to come to you in a second, but first I just want to scan the room to see if there are more questions. I have one here, and also one online. While we get the microphone to you, there's also one down here, so let's line that up. I have a question online from Dina Mufti, who asks, what are India's equivalents to Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft? So let's bear that in mind. Let's hear from you, sir, and have a question from you straight afterwards.
Hello, my name is Dwayne Hawesi, and I'm a data scientist at Frontières. And I was rather interested in the comments the panelists made about us not going towards a fractured future of digital technology. I agreed with a lot of the points Samir raised up. In terms of AI modeling, a lot of AI models are, like Icon and Build have taken consideration data privacy laws of GDPR, EU, and what the UK is doing as well, particularly in banking, for example, predicting whether someone's going into debt. How do you handle data like that without ethical, crossing ethical boundaries? Like the EU is doing a lot of good things in these kind of considerations. It does affect the accuracy of our models, or we might have to implement certain types of encryption which take up much more computing power. These are all considerations China or Russia may not have. And at the same time as well, are we in the same AI race? Are we going to the same goals? For example, Russia and China might be using AI for much more spurious goals than we are. We're utilizing it to aid industry. They might be utilizing it to reshuffle society.
Thank you. And your question.
I'm Carol, also a Chiefness schooler. We can see that by precisely what you say, Ms. Samir, transparency is a big word regarding either if you are from global north or global south. And I was wondering if transparency could be precisely one of the main goals regarding avoiding this type of split, because we're talking a lot about private sector, but also states lacks a lot regarding being transparent in what they do. We talk a lot about norms, but the biggest countries doesn't follow the norms when it's not convenient. So then how can we trust? So regarding that, you and also the panel, what do you think that transparency could do for us in terms of really creating legislation that is going to work for both private and public sector?
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to come first to Julie and then Wendy for responses to those questions, or in fact, bearing in mind that we've got 2 minutes left, I think 3 questions. I think, so just sort of some final remarks from you, and then I'll also come to Ava and then Samir before wrapping the session. So Julie, please. We've had AI, race and ethics, transparency and norms. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot, but
it's
I
think
I can summarize my answer to all of these by saying it's even more than ever important to invest in the multi-stakeholder collaboration and the multi-stakeholder governance model. But we must do it differently. The way it is now, it's stuck, right? We say that we collaborate with between governments, companies, and civil society organizations. That is not true. There are lots of power imbalances that make the participation of civil society actors quasi-impossible and makes their inputs quasi-unheardable. So I am a ardent advocate for multi-stakeholder collaboration that are meaningful and inclusive, although inclusive might not be the right word, because it's as if we were, taking third-party external parties and including them in the party. But we can discuss that at another point. The second very short point that I would like to make is, okay, I forgot my idea, but just wanted to share that it's important to be multi-stakeholder and
Julie,
collaborative.
You can't see the audience, but just your point about multi-stakeholder governance being really important and also being stuck was getting a lot of resonance around the room here. So it can often be difficult for remote speakers to know whether they're resonating with the crowd, but I just wanted to let you know that, and thank you very much for that input. Wendy Hall, can I just ask for your response on those questions, or just really, how we avoid a fragmented future for our technology?
Well, most of your people seem to want a fragmented future, or at least...
They didn't say they wanted it, they thought it was inevitable.
But it depends where level you're... What people don't understand... Well, sorry, I actually just want to say what he said. right? I thought Samir was just brilliant.
Yeah.
And, you know, you picked up on my ideas, my thoughts, and you said exactly what I would have said to many of those things. And I would say to Malawi, you need to develop your own views on things. I don't say you're going to develop, a new internet, but you definitely need an AI strategy. No matter how small a country you are, you need to think about how you're going to use it. We're going to have a proliferation of AI regulation, documents coming from all over the world. I don't know if America will do one or not, but everyone else will, including China. There's a point about China's doing things to reshape society and we're doing all stuff for good. That is not true, right? That is not true. That's why we need people to come up with regulation and governance. We are just as capable of misusing AI technology and the internet as anybody else, right? No matter how democratic we are or we are not. It is not black and, black, can't say that, can I? It is not, you know, China's all bad and we're all good. That is not the case. Okay. And there are many things we agree on, actually, like we want cures for cancer. Wherever you live in the world, we want to use AI for that sort of good. Then your cultural values sit on top of that. In terms of the person who was very, said it was fractured to start with, it may have been, but we've had 50 years of the internet and it's really difficult to unravel that. It's sort of like a live experiment we've done in the world and we can't unpick it. We are where we are. We can't unpick what happened and start again. Some people are arguing for that. There are people who want to change the way the internet operates at many different levels. And the thing that you really need to understand is it's all about layers. And if you change one layer, you affect another. And you know, as I said right back at the beginning, if you allow complete fragmentation, the internet will end up like a mobile phone world, and it will be very different to what we have today. Is that what you want? Do you not want to be out? So I could talk forever. Sorry, but you are now minus 2 minutes, so I have to shut up.
Well, thank you.
And
very
I'm a
much,
techie,
Wendy.
and I talk policy to government, by the way, to the gentleman who said techies are not working with policymakers. I seem to spend all my time talking to policymakers at the moment, but there you go.
Thank you. Eva, can I ask for your minus 10 seconds final remarks, and then I'll finish with Samir. And apologies, because we could continue this conversation in much more depth with these wonderful speakers we have. Eva.
Thanks a lot. I just would like to also support the multi-stakeholders approach. I think everyone is part of the solution, but very often I sit at some of those tables and I hear an ideological point of view, a second one, a third one. Everybody says their opinion, but there's a little less time always left for the actual brainstorming and finding areas where we could bridge our differences and work together. So hopefully we'll be mature enough in the months and years to come to find that approach more meaningful in order for this fragmentation to be less than it currently is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva.
So what was the question you asked me from the net? What are India's equivalent to?
Well, to Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft.
The equivalent are Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft.
Yes.
Two of them are run by Indians, and two of them have the biggest markets in India. So go figure that. So those are our equivalent to all four of those. But that's not the point. The point here is that it doesn't matter where these companies are headquartered. I think what Julie was mentioning here is very important. Are they accountable to the communities they serve? And can we build the framework where they are accountable not just to Americans, but to the communities who are indeed the ones who rely on them? And I do not believe California laws or Californian companies today really care about many parts of the world. India, they do increasingly because we are a big market. But I'm worried about the smaller countries. Do they figure in their calculus? Do they really cater to them? And that's the first question. The second question is transparency. I think, first of all, we have to get many of these things out of the box. Every time you question the tech companies, they throw, oh, that's an algorithm. What the hell is an algorithm? Sorry, I was going to go into my French speaking right now. But what is this algorithm, man? We need if it's algorithm, then we need accountable algorithms. And I think it's time to unwrap some of these decision-making processes. You cannot continue to have people rely on your algorithms. They need to know why you decided in a particular way. And I think this needs to stop. And the third is the final point on data. And I think that's really important. Look, I am more than willing to share my data for purposes that will give me better healthcare, better financial products, better mobility options, better travel plans, better immigration at airports. You know, you have those fast batches. Now, I am willing to do all of this as long as I am in control. I decide to do it, and I can decide to opt out of it. I can decide when my data has to be used and when it should not be used. The question is, do you own your data? The question is not what the data is used for. I think use cases are many, and increasingly we are going to be using it for all sorts of things. Now, why the debate has risen is because many of these autocratic countries don't ask the citizens what they are using the data for. And they are building the tools for the future by pirated data sets. While we will have protest on the streets if we start creating projects where we are using it for better Medicare. So we have our hands tied behind our back, and we are competing with a different technology system that is running quite fast. So I think, therefore, democracies need to collaborate and have a real response to the development challenges that are not going to wait for the West to sort out its mess, because others are offering solutions. And I think that's the question.
Thank you very much.
Emily, if I could just briefly, yes, on transparency, just wanted to throw in out there that the Oversight Board is pushing Facebook to be more transparent on its content moderation processes. Please read our latest transparency report, which just came out today and details the number of recommendations and decisions we've made and how impactful we have been for the platform.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Because you had another point earlier and it slipped your mind, so that was it. And thank you very much for coming in with that. We're a little over time, and thank you for your patience at having your coffee break nibbled into. That brings our session to a close. The next plenary session is entitled Reinvigorating and Renewing Democracy, and we'll begin here in 30 minutes. And the fourth round of spotlight sessions, titled Debt, Sustainability and Financing After the Pandemic and Financing Low Carbon Transition, will begin in the breakout rooms upstairs, also after the coffee break, at 5 o'clock. So thank you all for your attention, your questions. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, both here in the room and in cyberspace. I'd like to thank the panelists with you. Thank you.